Bill Winney, welcome to the Star-Tribune.
Glad to be here.
So we'll get right into it. We've got a number of questions here, so let's start rolling. How would you characterize how Cindy Hill has run the Department of Education, when she has been, anyway?
I have been uncomfortable with what I've seen, and I just like to leave it at that because she's not in the campaign, she's not an opponent, and I'm not really here to go after her directly. So yeah, I've been uncomfortable with it, but like I said, I'd like to leave it there.
And yet, potentially, you're looking at replacing her, which means you'd be dealing with her legacy, you'd be dealing with her Department of Education, her former employees. How would you plan to heal the Department of Education and attitude, cohesion, and outlook?
Well, the way I don't know that I'd talk about healing things, but several times across my career, I've taken over organizations, chief engineer, commanding officer of Benjamin Franklin, commanding officer of Holland, this ship here. This ship had a crew of 1,400. And what you do when you first come in is you communicate your ways of doing business and your philosophies of how you're going to run things. And you're always coming in behind other people. Sometimes other people that haven't done very well, and sometimes other people that did very well. The guy that I relieved when I took over Holland was a friend I had known. I didn't like the way he ran the ship. On the other hand, he was the kind of guy that made admiral. I'd like to think I was in the running for it, but that's a separate issue. And so, when you come in, the fact that the predecessor ran things a certain way and the fact that I may or may not have agreed with that almost doesn't make any difference. What's important is how you go forward, how you deal with your people, how you communicate your philosophies to them. It's your responsibility as the boss to go to your people and communicate to them how you're going to do business, how you sit down with them and talk to them, how you're going to hold them accountable. And you have to communicate to them your respect for the job they do. That's important. I mean, there's a lot of good people in the Department of Education, a lot of good people in a lot of other places around the state that I would work with. And many of them are doing a fine job, and they should be respected for that job. And I will do that. That's how I ran my business. You'll see, if you go to my website, you'll see a tab on there labeled Excellence, and you'll see some correspondence I received while in command that'll show you how I ran my ships, not in the details, but that the effect of how I ran my ships was successful. And you have to recognize when you're the boss that if you say something, you decide you want to do X, and you communicate it to your people, whether you do it in writing or verbally, but they go and do Y. You have to go look at that and say, did I really tell them clearly what I wanted? And until you can say, yeah, I did so, you don't go after them. You go back and reformulate how you communicated this to them. That's your responsibility as the leader, to get it right. Because just because you write something and say, I want you to do this, doesn't mean they read it the same way you wrote it. So you get the idea. You have to just go back and retrace your steps and make sure you did it right. Those kind of things, the confidence the people have in the leader, that the leader will hold himself responsible for communicating things to them, and he won't beat up on them when they interpret something differently, but he'll go work it again. That's important to an organization. And I had that experience in my Navy career. I had some people I worked for as a junior officer that I came to detest. Well, okay, that happens. Sometimes you get bosses you don't like. You still go on and do your job. But as a result of that experience, I said, okay, when I'm wearing those shoes, what will I do differently? And the thing is, how do you hold yourself responsible for properly, clearly, and effectively communicating what you want? And that's what I would offer you as a fundamental difference between myself and what I perceive to have been Cindy Hill's way of doing business.
How would you characterize the difference between leading an organization, in this case with the Navy ship, a military organization versus a very non-military, can opt out at any time civilian organization, and a large one, like the Department of Education.
Well, I understand. This ship was a crew of 1,400 men and women, and I've worked in the Washington, D.C. arena with far larger groups of people. People frequently presume that because you're in the military that you can just make people do things. That's true. You do have that kind of authority, but in the business world, there's an awful lot of business people that can just make their people do things too. My comeback to that is that isn't the way the good ships run. The good ships are run by people that don't make people do things. When you have to make people do things, you have lost control because you can't control everybody in a large organization. So how do you lead? You walk around, you talk to people, you work at that issue I mentioned earlier of conceiving what you want to do, putting it into words, communicating that to your people, reworking it if it doesn't work out the way you thought, and you go out and talk to people. In this case, the superintendent of public instruction has to talk with and work with the legislature to get legislation formed. And that's got to be an iterative process. You don't just go in and slam something down and say, pass this, because first, they're not going to do it, but second, if they don't like it, they may completely change it. So you got to iterate with them. You work with the State Board of Education. You work with the local school boards and the local administrators and the parents and the teachers, and you talk with them. You travel around the state. And you listen. One of the key things about how I ran my ships was you never know where the good ideas are going to come from. You have to be alert for a good idea from the most junior guy on your ship. If you've seen the movie Hunt for Red October, you might remember a scene in there where the skipper of the submarine is talking with Jonesy, the sonar tech. I mean, let's talk about a differential in authority. Here's the skipper of the submarine, and here's the sonar technician. And Jonesy is on there at the chart table, and he's saying, the Red October's got to be over here, skipper. He can't be here, and here's why. And one of the ways you do business that's out of the culture I grew up in the submarine force is you go to the guy that can answer your question. You don't stand on rank and hierarchy and chain of command. You go right to the guy that can answer your question and you work it out. You got to be ready to listen, like I said. So the other thing is when you talk to people and they haven't done something the way you wanted it, and you're pretty sure you communicated it accurately, you don't start out a conversation with you something. You start out a conversation with that wasn't acceptable performance or behavior or however, whatever might fit. So the two of you are focusing on the behavior, not on the interpersonal of you're a turkey or whatever you might use. And so those are the kind of tools that I would use on an interpersonal basis. And like I said, the good ships in the Navy, I think, do not run in that perceived military way of doing business. They operate by leadership, by people going out and talking and working with their people, by formulating ideas, by interacting the ideas back and forth. Because just because you're the skipper of the ship and you have this idea doesn't mean it's a good idea. It might not be a good idea. And you need people to tell you that. They've got to be willing to talk to you and say, skipper, Red October's over here, not over here. You ought to rethink that. You got to be ready to accept that kind of thing.
So tell me why, you've run as an independent before.
Yes.
Why are you running as a Republican now?
I had a good friend out in Pinedale who has been working on me for a number of months, and he convinced me that I should do this. So here I am.
And yeah, you've got a number of other candidates for the position, most of them also Republican. How do you differentiate yourself from them in this race?
Well, if you would think about some of the things I've just talked about with regard to leadership and how I would do business, I think those elements would be part of that. The other piece of it is my differentiation would be my other two opponents in the primary will give you turn the hand crank, lubricate the wheels, keep the gears turning. They're going to make the organization run, but I perceive them as bureaucrats, if you will. they will continue to run the organization much as it is. It's as if one more good program will make the organization better. It's as if their passion will somehow transform the organization. And if you don't look beyond that and look at how the leader himself or herself interacts with their people, works on good ideas, interacts with the legislature. You got to make the legislature confident that the things you're doing are going to be successful. If they're not confident, they're going to go off on tangents on you, and they're going to do things that are going to slow you down. You got to make sure you iterate with the state school board and the local school boards. So that's how I would differentiate myself, that thought of how do you get people to work with you instead of just for you. I think I bring that to the table, and I think, again, if you look at my website at that tab marked Excellence, you'll see some indicators, just indicators that, I was in command for 5 years, and so there's just 2 things on there, but you'll get the idea, I hope. That's how I would differentiate myself.
But you're calling them your bureaucrats, wheel turning, and yet all I've heard from you so far is talking about interpersonal relations and building those connections and approaching differently how you find fault with somebody's performance. So let's talk policies then. What would be the biggest shift for the Department of Education under you from where it is now under Cindy?
As I have observed our legislature for 10 years and 6 years talking education or looking at education, and you go take a look at the guest columns that you guys have very graciously published of mine over the last 2 or 3 years on education. One of the things I've criticized them on is they're talking about an evaluation system. And I got up in front of, I believe it was last October, at an interim committee hearing in Cheyenne, and I said, what are you going to do with these evaluations? You're going to spend all this administrative time preparing them, and you're going to do what? Put them in a file cabinet? You're going to drag them out when you decide you want to get rid of somebody? Why don't they fit into a bigger system, an overarching system of what we do with teachers? One of the other things I brought up in those comments, in public comment, is I don't see much for teachers to aspire to. You take a teacher on day one, they come out of college, they start teaching, and you look at them at the end of a 30 or 35 year career, and what have they had to aspire to? Now, I'm not talking about longevity pay raises or cost of living pay raises or a pay raise that comes when you go get an advanced degree. I'm talking about a system that has things in it, and you do see some of these in the larger school systems, but you don't see them in the smaller school systems in the state. Things like a department chair, where a teacher moves above just teaching. They continue teaching, but they also are a department chair, say history, and they supervise other teachers in some small feature way. That kind of thing would bring with it an increase in pay and some increases in responsibility. I would envision in the state probably 3 or 4 steps that a teacher might look to across a career. Other steps need to be hashed out, worked out in the system. But the idea is, if you want teachers to work and to be inventive and to show initiative, they ought to have something that they can aspire to beyond just being in front of a history class for 30 years. And so I would envision these evaluation systems, which can serve both positive and negative. I mean, let's be clear, evaluations can serve to get rid of a teacher if they're not performing. But they also should serve to improve a teacher, and they also should serve for the teacher to want to improve themselves and have their students do better. So that's one thing I would talk to is how do you build a system where teachers have something to aspire to across a career? The second thing I would look at is testing. You'll see this in one of my guest columns, testing, testing, testing. Be careful what you ask for, you might get it. And I was kind of going after the legislature with that thought because they have an inordinate amount of testing that our young people do. For example, if you look at, let me make sure I get the letters right, the MAP testing in the middle school and the high schools, 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade, twice a year. 3 times a year if you're an at-risk student. Now stop and think about that. How much time is expended with a young person just sitting there taking a test? When I've gone to a door and talked to a family and there's a student in the background, usually high school or middle school, but typically high school, and I talk about too much testing to the parent with the student in the background, invariably, and this has only happened probably 4 or 5, 6 times, but because you need the proximity of the student, but invariably I hear the student say, yes, somebody gets it, because they recognize they're losing time when they're sitting there taking a test. I have no problem with doing some amount of testing. You got to know where your young people are. You got to know whether they're getting what you're teaching. You don't want to find out in 12th grade that they missed something 2 or 3 years ago. But the amount of testing, the MAP testing, the PAWS testing, the SAWS testing, and there's a couple more they do, is so onerous as to detract from the teacher's time teaching. I would change that. I will have to work with that. That's not going to happen overnight. The legislature has done the things they have done for some very specific reasons, and I'm going to have to make them confident that I will improve the system by reducing testing. But those are a couple examples of things I would bring in.
So of the existing testing formats or testing options, I guess you want to call it, out there, are there ones that you consider valuable, or would you scrap them all and you want to start over?
Well, I don't say I would scrap the test. I would change the volume of testing. The tests themselves, the PAWS tests, the MAP tests, simply as a test to find out what a young person is thinking and getting from school, are probably valid tests. The question isn't whether the test itself is a good test. The question is, how many times do you give it to them? How much time do you spend in the testing room instead of in the classroom?
Well, that's say with the kid agreeing. I mean, my daughter would probably say that any testing is useless and a waste of her time, but she's not necessarily right.
Well, like I said, there's nothing wrong with doing something to find out where the kids are, make sure they're getting what you want them to get. If I was going to do testing, I'd probably do it once a year, and probably in, say, May, so you see how the year has gone. And then you don't do it again until the next May, that kind of thing. It's the volume of testing that is holding us back.
So let's talk about relations with the legislature and the State Board of Education. And some legislators have called it a decades-long turmoil between the legislature, the Department of Education, the State Board of Education. What's your view on that, and what would you do about it?
Well, I've kind of touched on those already as you picked up the thread. And like I said, having been there observing these people and looking at education for about 6 years, and keep in mind my wife is a career educator, so I've also heard things from her. She was across many school systems as we went where the Navy landed us. I had my own little bit of experience at the chalkboard. But you got to stand up in front of the legislators and talk to them. You also have to work with them out in the passageways sometimes, which is things I've kind of done as a private citizen. They know who I am. I know a number of the legislators. I wouldn't presume too much with that, but they've seen me. They've heard me talk in public comment on education or other things. I've made sure when I get up in public comment that I have something useful to say to them. You got the evaluation system. I have an extensive background with evaluation systems in the military, the officer system, the enlisted system, the chief petty officer. I had to learn the Air Force system when I was on joint duty. And then I was on Navy selection boards, so I saw how they really got used. You don't just put them in a file cabinet. And I got up and spoke on that one time in a public comment. And it was Senator Jim Anderson, I think Jim Anderson from the district I think he's from the district near Glen Rock, the tall, white-haired gentleman. He's been the president of the Senate. He and I chatted briefly afterwards, and he commented to me that he was glad I got up and spoke about it because he wanted to hear what I had to say. Don't know whether he agreed with me or not. Doesn't make any difference whether he did or not. The point is the interaction where he listened to you and he thought it might be important. And so you have those kind of conversations with these guys. They have to be comfortable that you're doing what they want to do. And at, at the bottom of the process, what they want to do is they want to see improvement in student performance, which they haven't seen over 10 years. And they have transitioned, in my opinion, and I think I said this on one of my guest columns that you so graciously published, that they were acting like a super school board. I don't like that. It isn't the right thing for them to get down into that level of detail as a legislature. And so I will work to move them back from that. And that takes them being confident in what I'm doing. Excuse me a second. Confident in my thinking, confident in my ability to go out and gather information and propose things that they like, that they think will get them where they want to go. They also need to realize that you're going to do what they say they want you to do. One of the things you also experience in the military service is what's commonly called a green ID card tour, which is where you work for somebody you don't like. You get up in the morning, you have your cup of coffee, you pull out your ID card, and if it's still green, which is active duty, you go into work that day. Yeah, I've had some bosses like that. Okay, got it. That happens. Get over it. They need to make sure that I'm listening to them, and that whether I like what they do or not, that I will carry it out to the best of my ability. And that if I don't like something, I'll work with them to try and change it through them to something I think will work better. That kind of confidence is important. Same thing with the state school board. I had a conversation with Ron Michaeli when they had a state school board meeting out in Jackson probably a year or so ago, again about the evaluation thing. And so, I haven't observed the state school board as much as the legislature, but nevertheless that kind of process, making them confident that I'm going to go off and do things the way they perceive it ought to be done.
So let's talk about something specific from the legislature, the next generation science standards that got essentially barred from discussion with the State Board of Education through a budget footnote. Did you agree with how that was done?
No. Again, that's the legislature getting into the details. I don't necessarily have a problem with the legislature not wanting those decisions to be made. It's like the Common Core. I think it was 5 years ago where the State Board adopted Common Core, and now the legislature is trying to unthread that process. That stuff was done some years ago with a different mindset than we have today because we've learned more about Common Core. That threat of telling teachers how to run their classroom wasn't present among teachers 5 years ago. They hadn't seen enough of it to express that opinion. Now they have. I think the legislature should have come out and made it very clear that they did not want the State Board of Education or the Department of Education continuing down that path. And then as you go into the coming curriculum process with the State Board, which will culminate in, I think it's 2017, the legislature makes clear that they want them to go a different path, and then the school board perhaps does that, or the State Department of Education. But the way they did the budget note, the budget footnote, and there was another bill, Senate File 12, I'll have to think of it. It didn't pass because they couldn't agree in conference, but there was a paragraph inserted there. If you pull it up on the LSO website, you'll see a red paragraph, I think it's on page 2, that's very explicit about no organization in the state can commit the state to outside things like it doesn't say Common Core, but outside things, that Common Core being the idea. Like I said, that bill didn't pass, but you can go see the words on the LSO website. Again, they're getting down into the details of what's going on. And If you think about how organizations function, that's not good for how the State Department, well, excuse me, the state educational system functions, for the legislature to be getting into that level of detail. So I would have done it differently had I been in the legislature, or I would have worked to do it differently. And I would work to get those guys to be comfortable that I will listen to what they want done and march off and do it.
Some of your opponents have longer terms of traditional classroom experience. How would you characterize your classroom experience, and how do you think that would be reflected in how you'd be the head of the Department of Education?
Well, I think first it's important that the person in charge of the outfit has worn the shoes, which I did for a couple years. I was teaching in the Navy nuclear propulsion training out in Idaho at the chalkboard back in the 70s. We really did use chalkboards then. And you learn about how students absorb information. At the end of the day, the students I was teaching out there, the officer students, had to stand up in front of an oral board with 5 members, and they had to be able to explain things to the board, and you didn't quite know what the questions would be, but you had to teach them the theory and the practical sides of that so that they had the depth to field questions. I also supervised the enlisted training out there. And that was a little over 2 years doing that. Allied with that, over the years, I watched my wife teach in many places. She taught in Firth, Idaho, for instance, while I was out there. She's taught many other places, South Carolina, Tidewater, Virginia, Northern Virginia, Hawaii, Nebraska, Guam. And I've absorbed at the dinner table, if you will, her comments about how things are going, how things run, how the administrators work with her. But what I would characterize is the fact that I have a perception of what a teacher is facing in the classroom from both sides, from the students and from the administration. You know, when you're a skipper on a ship, you can slow things down. You can do things that hinders your people. And you have to have a perception that you can do that you can do something that holds them back instead of enables better performance. And you have to be willing to rethink what you're doing and say, what am I doing that's slowing people down? What am I doing that's hindering? There's some things you got to do. In the nuclear submarine world, we have a thing called subsafe. It's not the time to figure out that you did something wrong when you're at 1,000 feet in your submarine and a leak just started. So there's some rules and regulations you got to follow. I got it. And that's part of the legislature's way of doing business, is they want the system to do things. But the other side of that is there's a lot of things you do that come under the category of we've always done it that way. And I learned to be disrespectful of that phrase. When you ask somebody, why are you doing something? And they say, well, you know, boss, we've always done it that way. That's probably time to go look carefully and see whether whatever that thing is serves what you really want to do. And so, you know, I got it. I've got a little over a couple years at the chalkboard. I have a number of years supervising training and education, chief engineer, commanding officer on a nuclear submarine, because how your ship performs, which you see on an annual basis, you have an annual exam of a couple days, which includes both hands-on performance of stuff and knowledge interviews where they sit down one-on-one with somebody. How you perform has a big impact on your career, how the ship performs, and you have to just stand back and let your sailors perform. And that's what we're facing with teachers. The administrators try, but at the end of the day, it's that teacher in front of the classroom, the performance of that teacher, and the performance of the student that is what the legislature is trying to do. And you can always get in there with these things and put your thumb on people, and you got to do this and you got to do that. If you don't have the graciousness to accept the fact that you might be slowing them down and maybe you can do something differently, you don't understand the problem. And I bring a very clear background of having led in such a way where I reduced requirements on people that I think will serve the state well.
So one last question from me. So as one of the statewide elected officials, you'd be on a number of boards, including the State Land Investment Board. What's your philosophy on how the state should play a role in economic development and community development?
Well, the state has to do it very carefully. One of the bills I paid attention to this last legislature was a bill having to do with a state loan for a pharmaceutical proposal up in Cody. And the company was going to put up like $50 million for it, and they wanted the state to give a low-interest loan of around $25 million. And I had a chance to converse with Bill Schilling of the Wyoming Business Council about it, and he was a little bit skeptical of it. And the thought that comes back to mind was he wanted due diligence. He wasn't sure it was going to be a good investment for the state to do that. It looked to me on the face of it, what I heard in the testimony in front of the committees, was it looked like a pretty good idea. And so my approach to that would be the state has a role in getting things going. The state's got to be very careful in not putting their thumb on the scales. Stuff has to be, in fact, viable on a business basis. And that was Bill Schilling's reluctance on this. Was he apparently his top level look at it so far had said maybe this isn't such a good idea. So you got to, when you're on one of those boards, you got to listen to what is coming into you. You got to listen to organizations like the Business Council and see what they think about it, and roll that together and make sure you aren't just funding somebody's pet project, but you're funding something that'll in fact make the state a better state in the business sense of things.
Any other questions? Well, we're overshooting our time a little bit, but I want to give you a chance to give some closing comments you'd like to make.
Well, I enjoyed the opportunity on that Wyoming and Cheyenne Chamber of Commerce thing the other day. I had a chance to talk about some of the things I've just did here, or just talked of here. That idea of how do you get people to work with you instead of just for you was a big thing about how I ran my ships. How do you motivate your people? How do you criticize them when they haven't done something right? But also, what's your responsibility when they haven't done something right? Because maybe they thought they were doing what you said, and you just didn't say it right. All of those things come together. Wyoming has been mired in mediocrity in education, and I would call it a comfortable, perhaps, mediocrity. They just kind of muddle along, and how do you lift people above that? And the way I would do that is working within the system with the legislature to get the teacher in front of the classroom to be able to take initiative and to think through things and invent the wheel differently, invent a better mousetrap. And right now our system doesn't do that. Our administration, I'm just uncomfortable with how the administration is working. I think the administration can work better, and that's the fundamental thing I would do. I have frequently used the phrase, get the system out of the way of the wrench turners. Wrench turners, obviously, on a ship like Holland, which was a repair organization, supply support outfit. Well, we're talking about teachers. We're not talking about wrench turners. But teachers are professionals. They've got degrees, many of them advanced degrees. Why do we have to tell them how to run their classroom? Why can't we let them sit in there in front of their young people, fit things to what the young people are doing, what they're thinking? Young people mature at different rates. Let the teacher solve that. Don't give them a system that tries to solve it for them. That's one of the weaknesses, as I mentioned, in Common Core. So that's the kind of thing I would bring to the process, and plus a due respect for my wife across my career was a good Navy wife. She did a lot of things, picked up and moved. We moved some 19 times. I saw her teach in a number of different systems, some good, some not so good. A respect for what I saw her do and the problems she had to solve across a career. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much for coming here. It's a pleasure.